Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'm delighted have a number of old friends, young friends, friends of Umar in the audience today. Umar is Omar Khan, and I go back a long way in the sense that Umar was living in Islamabad. His grandparents came from Lahore. His grandmother certainly came from Lahore, as you'll discover in this particular book. And many years ago, I opened Dawn, and there was an article on Bourne and Baker, who were two Victorian photographers. And I thought, well, who is this nutcase in Islamabad who is interested in Victorian photography? So I called him, and I went across to Islamabad and had tea with him and his delightful sister, Aisha, who's here today, and also his mother. Okay? She, by the way, is Dutch. His father was the late Dr. Munir Ahmed Khan, who was the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. And as you know, another member of the Atomic Energy Commission also had a Dutch wife. I have always held it against Shanaz, and I said, if only you'd been Dutch, I would have been a nuclear scientist by now and invented the bomb. Aisha bought a copy of my book, Sketches from a Howdah, which weighed exactly 2.5 kilos, in the same as this book, and had to carry it all the way to San Francisco for you. So welcome to Lahore, and I want to thank Razi and the LLF for making it possible for you to have a second homecoming, as it were, to Lahore. So welcome, Lahore. The structure of the presentation is going to be that Umar will present about 70 to 75 slides. And what I thought would be convenient for all of you would be to see the slides in the context in which he'll be talking about them. And then at various points, I will interject and just ask for a clarification, which might help you to put them in context. So is that okay with you, Umar?
Absolutely.
Perfect. Now, one question just before we start, Umar. How many of you have actually handled or written a postcard in your lives? How many of you haven't? Okay, well, thank God you have, because I brought an example. And this is really what we'll be talking about. This was the equivalent of what is today the email, and it was a picture postcard. And it contained on the reverse whatever brief inscription there was, and it had to be necessarily brief, to convey an idea, a thought, a remembrance, a token of affection. This particular one is from my collection, and this is dated 1917, so it's 102 years old. So perhaps the best way of beginning is with Umar. How did postcards come into vogue, and why?
Great. Well, thank you for that introduction, Ijaz. Thank you to the LLF for inviting me. Thank you for your encouragement over the many years. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. And let me begin by sort of talking to you about how I got interested in postcard and telling you a little bit about how the whole field began. So I live in San Francisco, and in 1995, someone gave me a flyer to go to a vintage paper fair in a place called Concord, which is about a 2-hour drive from the city. And I thought, am I going to go? Am I not going to go? So I finally went. And while there, I found boxes and boxes of postcards of India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. And I could not believe the amount of postcards of the subcontinent that were there, that were 100 or more years old. I found this postcard, Women Baking Bread. And when I picked it up, it immediately took me back to my grandmother's house here at 5 Queens Road in Lahore in the 1960s, where she would sit in the veranda with a servant girl or a niece or an aunt, shelling peas, making chapatis. The charpai would be propped up like that. The mudka would be there to keep the milk from the billy. It was an incredibly, to me, Proustian moment, and that really began a postcard collection spree that has lasted, 20-some years. I probably have about 15,000 or more postcards at this point. And this turns out to be a very rare postcard, and I'll tell you about who made it in a moment. But I think that moment that this postcard was for me was much like postcards were for people around 1900. And we don't realize today that postcards were the Instagram of their time. This was the beginning of the picture mad age that we live in today. We went from maybe 10 or 20 million postcards in 1895 to 300 million postcards produced in 1898 to 1.7 billion postcards produced in Germany alone in 1900. There was this incredible ascendancy, and this was the first time that people in the world could see what other places looked like on a picture with a personal message from somebody else. And it really connected the world visually in a way that had never happened before. You certainly had photographs, you had newspapers and things like that, but postcards were an explosion of the visual medium. And it was a golden age until World War I, and it really tied the world together in a way then that Instagram and Facebook and other kinds of platforms do today. And we really need to think of postcards as a platform because it was laws that allowed this kind of a medium to be sent. You had royalty systems where you paid postage. The postal service that was delivering the postcard got some piece of that because it took money. You had formats, you had rules around where you could write and so forth. So it really was a set of, like an HTTP protocol runs the web, you had different protocols and different systems that enabled this form to take off. So today I want to really focus on postcards of Pakistan and look at some of the incredible visual richness of this country that was sort of demonstrated in this medium then. But let me start at the very beginning and talk a little bit about how postcards really came to be in the late 1890s and what were the formats. So advertising was the beginning of postcards because they were very expensive to make, and you had to use lithographic means to produce them. So the Singer Manufacturing Company, and you'll see many of the brands that we still know today, were actually very big in the postcard business. This is a postcard from 1892, and it was probably the very first postcard of India that was ever produced. It was an advertising card. Singer, Mr. Nusarvanji Patel, who was in Bombay, had his family members, they were all Parsi, be on these postcards. And as we all know, you had the Darzi with his Singer machine come to your house strapped to a bicycle. This was the beginning of that, and postcards were used to help make Singer actually a very prominent brand company in this country, in this subcontinent. You also had Nestle come in. Now, Nestle on its website says that their relationship to India only began in 1912, but this is a postcard from 1900. The 20th Punjab Infantry was actually critical to capturing the Khyber Pass in 1878. And in 1897-98, when there was another big uprising on the frontier, the 20th Punjab played a big role in that, and this postcard was out there celebrating it, and I have many dated from about 1900. You also had this Serravalle Wines postcard, an Italian firm. They had all these elixirs and tonics in Europe at that time that people thought, would magically cure different diseases. This shows one actually from Sindh. I sometimes think it might actually be an Arab country that was named Sindh, but all the other postcards in the series actually come from India, so I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. And this is a postcard from Karachi. This is a lithographic postcard, again, very expensive to produce. And you can see the way the steamer in the back and the actual local Indus ship are contrasted in the foreground. And it was thanks to ships that postcards were actually enabled, because a ship journey from Marseille through the Suez Canal to Karachi or Bombay was 2 weeks. So you could send a postcard and know that it would get to Europe in 2 weeks and come back. And there was this incredible global exchange with postcards from the very beginning. Because if you were a photographer in Lahore and you sent a photograph to a publisher in Germany, they would print the postcard, send it back to you. You might sell it to a tourist out here on the mall, who would then send it to somebody in England or America. So already it was a global product, crisscrossing the world, maybe more than 2 times before it actually got to its destination.
Omar, can I just stop you for a
Please.
second? Could you explain the types of postcards? For example, the technique that was used for calotypes and
Exactly.
Because you mentioned lithographs, so
Right.
it'd be useful.
So these are all lithographic postcards. So I will show you the lithographic press in a
Of course,
second, and
later,
I'll come to it in a second. But a lithographic press is you have a stone with a drawing and one color. And then you put a sheet of paper in it and print that one color. Then you print the next color and the next color and the next color, each time having to align the paper to the print color from before. So like 12 colors, this might be a 6 or 8 color postcard. So it was a very complicated process. And once you use the stone, it had to be stored somewhere if you wanted to use it again. So you'd have these huge sort of warehouses of lithographic stones. So you quickly had to change it. I'm going to show you the next kind of postcard, because postcards were driven by business too. It was a consumer good, and you wanted to sell the postcard if you were a business person. So there was a lot of development of technologies, just like we see on the internet today, in the early years to bring prices down and to make it a mass-consumed item. And this is, by the way, a Texaco oil card from Karachi. This is around 1910. And they liked to show in those days that oil was put on a bullock cart and then taken to the place where you could buy oil. And again, old and new were contrasted here finally. So let's talk about some of the early publishers and the way the postcards began. And as Aijaz said, what are the different types? So Werner, the concept of a postcard was invented in Austria. And Mr. Werner Rössler, an Austrian photographer in Calcutta, was the first local Indian subcontinent publisher of postcards, as far as I can tell, and my friends who are collectors in India. This is 1897. The earliest date for sure we have is January 1897. So at the very beginning of postcards, and you can see as a lithographic card how complicated this actually is. This is 4 different photographs from him, put together on a print, a beautiful design put around it, printed probably in 12 colors, and that white space on the left is for the message to be written. You were not allowed to write a message on the back of a postcard in the early days. You had to write it in the front. And that only changed after like 1903 and 1905 in India. So you often can date postcards if there's no stamp by the way the postcard was structured. So I have all of Rössler's cards of Calcutta. I even have 2 signed by him. But believe it or not, 6 months ago I picked up this card, a card of Lahore by Rössler, which I would date to about certainly pre-1901, because it's this old British format that later was changed. British always like to do everything just a little bit different, and they only got with the rest of Europe in the early 1900s. So this is probably 1901 or earlier. As far as I can tell, it's probably the earliest postcard of Lahore that I know of. There are a couple of missionary cards which could be from 1898 that show Lahore Cathedral, but this is a scene, by him, and this is a collar type. And what happened with, the pressure to make postcards cheaper, because a good lithographic card cost 2 annas in the market, and that was expensive actually, and the color was costly. To bring the prices down, they actually started using glass plates instead of stones. They would take an impression of the image right on the glass plate and use that in a lithographic type press to print it, and you get a black and white image like this, much cheaper to produce. And you then had color types, which I'll show you for a moment. They're really beautiful cards. The German word for this was Lichtdruck, or light print. And you can just see, if you look at the woman on the right, if you just look at the gauze and the way, what she's wearing on the white and the red underneath, this was a very complicated printing job. And these color types took off right after 1900 and became the most popular kind of postcard. They were cheaper, and you could still have really nice resolution. And photographs show really well in color type, and you can blow them up in a way that you can't blow up halftones, which is using the dot matrix system that we're used to today with our computers, and they're used in newspapers and magazines. That doesn't blow up, because when you make it giant, you see the dots. But color types you can blow up actually, and we did that in India for the exhibitions. They look gorgeous. So there's actually there's a way in which, even as the technology got better, the quality went down, and we can see some examples of that. So Rössler was an important person. The Ravi Varma press in Bombay, now Mumbai, was also a very important sort of factor in the postcard revolution. Raja Ravi Varma, who's in the top left there, was India's most prominent painter at the end of the 1900s, and his paintings are still available everywhere, in part to sort of help promote his paintings and also support an independence movement. He, with Gokhale and others, put an 80,000 rupee investment in 1892 to bring lithographic press to India, and with it he brought 4 to 6 Germans, and actually the working language at the press was German in those days. And the chief lithographer, and you can sort of see what a press looked like, you see the stone plates there, you see the people working. There's not exactly his press, but I'm giving you examples of it. The chief lithographer at the press was a man called Paul Gerhardt. And he was a great painter, and he was the man who produced the first postcards of India, within India, that we can sort of trace very clearly, 1898, 1899. This is one of his cards in front of the Juma Masjid in Bombay. And you can see in the left the way he's using trompe l'oeil effects to show the minarets of the mosque, same as in Women Baking Bread. And I'm quite sure Women Baking Bread was produced as an experimental postcard by the Ravi Varma press. And sort of putting all that together and tracing this man's life a little bit, finding mention of him in the diaries and his great relationship with the Varma brothers was just part of the sort of interest for me as a detective to sort of track down what led to sort of the postcard revolutions and the different artists that were involved. And the other great artist was, I just could go to the next one, a fellow called M.V. Dhurandhar, also in Bombay. He worked at the press for some time. And he was really the first Indian who took postcards and made his own drawings and then had them done in the half-tone press. So the mullah, the prayer on the right side, was actually one of his most popular postcards, 1902. And he really depicted the people in the city of Bombay, all the different types, very nicely. And you see the Indian postman on the left, which is, we use that on the back of the book, another very famous postcard by him. The thing to note about a postcard like our social media today is that everybody could read the message along the way. So the postman often could read the message and would know what's going on. And as somebody in Chennai pointed out to me, actually, in the subcontinent, often the postcard deliverer, the postman, was a person who read the message to the recipient who might be illiterate, if they're in a village or even in a city. So you actually had that function that was very important. So it was okay for the postman to read the postcard. But people really protested at the beginning, like, what happened to our secrets? And it's not letter writing anymore. Just like we think of Facebook and Instagram posts as being too public, people had the same issues in those days.
Can I just mention, yes. The Dhurandhar was, as Omar has just mentioned, he was the first Indian head, but he was the first Indian head of the J.J. School of Arts in Bombay. In the same way as Shakir Ali Saab was the first Pakistani principal of an art college here, of the Mayo, formerly the Mayo School of Arts, and Shakir Saab studied at the J.J. School. So Dhurandhar and he, in a sense, are connected that way. And what the second point I want to break out, with your permission, is Dhurandhar introduced something which was motion. So the figures that you see here are not simply static. They're not static images, but they're moving. And so you see the postman reading it, or the mullah is offering a prayer. So there is a certain activity. It wasn't just as I said, a static picture of a situation. Please.
That's true. So, I think the important thing to realize is that even though postcards came in the early years as tourist objects, and they were colonial objects, in a couple of years, people in the subcontinent had turned it around and made postcards their own medium. And you had a tradition of bazaar cards arise and so forth. So they became much more than just a colonial means of depiction. And in the end, it was mainly photographers and publishers in the subcontinent who produced most of the postcards. And we'll talk about the independence movement shortly. So let's talk about the other concept of a postcard that's really important is the greetings from aspect. When you send a postcard from somebody, either explicitly in the 1890s and early 1900s, or even today, you're saying, hey, greetings from me to you from a place. And this is the earliest postcard that I know of that has that implicit message. This is a German postcard, and it shows Ranjit Singh's tomb here in Lahore, although it's Chinese people around, and it's supposed to depict Asia in general, but this is around early 1900. And by the way, people often confused places. You sometimes had the Atlas Mountains in Morocco shown as some kind of mountain range in India. So, it took a while for the Europeans to get it right, but, things improved over time. These greetings from, so the place with the most greetings from cards in Pakistan was certainly Peshawar. There were a lot, because you had a lot of army cantonments up there, so we have a lot of nice cards by D.C. Mehra, K.C. Mehra, and other publishers up there, often these beautiful color cards and these complex cards. The other card place which has a lot of greetings from cards is Quetta. And if you look carefully at this one, there are like 17 or 18 different photographs crammed into the word Quetta here, trying to show every possible aspect of the city. I haven't found any great greetings from Lahore cards yet, but I think they're out there. And the great thing about postcard collecting is you always discover something new. So I'm still looking forward to finding something like that.
Yes. The number of images reminds me of something which I found in Umar's book, where the space for the message was used for such interesting responses as, see it for yourself, I can't describe it. That was a brief message. Or, can't get time for that letter to mother. But these are the kind of pithy messages which would be included, which kind of reinforced the need for the illustration on the other side of the postcard. Please.
Exactly. So let's talk about Lahore for a moment and what are the postcards of this great city. So Fred Bremner was a photographer who came from Scotland in the 1880s, went to Quetta and Karachi, moved up here in the early 1900s. I think he was the first Lahore-based publisher of postcards that I know of. And this is the armory in the fort, and this is sort of a street. These are collotypes, and he was a really good photographer. And I once interviewed Sandy Rollo, you might know Rollo Trust on the Mall, who was a big photographer from here. He had hired an assistant from Bremner in the 30s, and that assistant said two things about Bremner. He was a hard-drinking man, and he did everything himself. So he really controlled the process and made some very actually beautiful postcards, and there are like dozens and dozens of the whole of Pakistan. Yes?
The picture on the left shows, as Umar has just mentioned, the armory. In fact, it was in the Sheesh Mahal. So as you enter the Sheesh Mahal, on the left-hand side, there is an arcade. And when the British took over following the Second Sikh War, all of the arms that they had recovered, they put on display. So that from there, they went and moved to what is now the Sikh Museum. Please.
Exactly. Yeah. And then this postcard is of Government College, but he had mislabeled it School of Arts, and then somebody had corrected it properly. So these are all, this is dated, I think, 1903. This is all the 1903, 1902 period of postcards where Bremner began his job. So the first postcard printing really happened in Middle Europe, sort of in Germany and Austria and Italy and so forth. But the British took over. So by 1905 and beyond, obviously the British, having the biggest empire, had a great printing shop called Tuck's, Raphael Tuck and Sons in London. And they really became, I would say, the premier color publisher of postcards of the subcontinent. And let's look at some of their Lahore examples. These postcards came in envelopes like this, 6 to an envelope, and this is the 1905 to 1910 period. So this is Badshahi Masjid, this is actually an embossed half-tone card. So if you look very carefully, you'll see that it's a little bit creased at the top, because what they did was after printing the card, it went into an embossing machine to make it a little bit more 3D-like. And that made the card a little bit more expensive and actually a little bit more like a painting. Yeah. And that's what the whole thing was. So they were called oilettes, was their brand name. Okay. And an oilette, they advertised as being a beautifully painted oil painting that was turned into a postcard. As it turns out in my research, most of the oilettes were actually photographs originally, and then they were colorized and then embossed and done different things too. And I've probably got about 100 oilettes out of their 700 or 800 of India that I've actually been able to find the original photograph for, and they would have bought that photograph from another publisher. I've not yet traced the original Lahore cards, but in any case, I'm sure that these two were originally photographs.
Well, it's interesting that there is this, in a sense, juxtaposition, because early lithographs were based, Hardings, etc., were based on sketches that were done here locally, sent to England, and converted into lithographs and then printed from stone. Here we have in reverse, they're basing these on photographs, etc., yes, right? And then converting them into, and they're made to look like watercolors, but actually they were not. They were originally photographs.
And you can understand this, obviously, economic pressure. Let's use the photograph and quickly develop the image, because who can paint all of this? It is very expensive. Yeah. So the pressure to bring prices down was critical to making this a mass media, and we can understand why. So this is the Lahore Museum, and then this is Shalimar Gardens. And, there's a real great sense of color, I think, and this is one of my favorite, Wazir Khan Masjid, which is, again, an embossed card, again, from a photograph, nice sense of use of shade. And, this is where, various Mughals and Kipling and, other people walked. And I think it's very nicely done. And they all have captions on the back, sometimes really stupid, but sometimes, interesting. So they're trying to give information as well about the place that they're showing. The other big publisher of Lahore postcards was actually a firm called Morley Dhar & Sons in Ambala, and they were a railway junction. So Morley Dhar & Sons and H.A. Mirza & Sons in Delhi really dominated North Indian postcard publishing from about 1905 to 1915. So they also had a lot of humorous postcards. So this is one of them. These are actually lithographs, and this just shows what happens if the servant takes over, the bungalow and does everything their own way.
But you have to explain why he's got the streak on his toe.
Yes, this is the pankha.
Pankha, well, where is the pankha?
It's off screen.
I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
It's in another room.
Yes.
And what he's doing is, it's through the hole in the wall, the aperture, he's pulling it. And the instructions used to be to visiting new British soldiers who came here, that even in high summer, you must always have a blanket. And the logic of it was that during the night, the servant would fall asleep, forget to use the pankha, and then he would wake up and suddenly pull it feverishly, and that would create a draft. The man would catch pneumonia and die. So they said you have to have a blanket, just in case. Please.
That's great. That's great. That's great. And this is another interesting, humorous card. How we make love in the East. It's one of the few cards I know that talks about relationships, between British soldiers and local women. In this case, a sweeper. So interesting, and that the cards, they reflect a lot about social reality, and you can often read in them what people were thinking, what they thought was funny. You have a number of their cards showing hard-drinking British soldiers and so forth. So there's a lot of social commentary in these cards as well. And this is actually a very beautiful card by the firm. Like you look at this launder, this is a adobe, and look how beautifully the grating of the wooden trusses are in the back. It's done green. The white looks really, really white. White was an expensive color to use actually on these cards, so they were really trying to get a message home. And very beautifully composed. And I think that, especially in the early days, the amount of effort that went into making cards beautiful objects is something that's really remarkable when you look at them today. So this I've just discovered about. This is a very popular card. This was done by, I think, Revachand Motumal and Sons in Karachi. So in theater in those days, you had men impersonating women. And this I just read about recently in the book Drama Queens by Vijay Sai, which came out in India. This is actually a female impersonator whose name was Vasi, and who drove crowds in Lahore crazy around 1905. And apparently, he was, the best of the best, and I'm still trying to do more research about him, but thanks to that book, I've been able to make this identification. If anybody knows anything about him, I'm dying to learn more. But these kinds of postcards were used, and you often had, well-known people photographed in postcards. Their name was taken off, and then they just became Nautch Girl or Indian actor or something like that, because they were made to represent a type. But you can look back and find out that often it was a famous person, actually, who was being depicted.
Omar, we have a modern equivalent. Mrs. Nawaz-e-Sharif. Young man who decided that he wanted to cross-dress. And he appeared on television, interviewing people.
Okay.
And there was somebody very close to us who was interviewed. She was a political figure. She had no idea that this was a man dressed as a woman interviewing her until halfway through the interview. So anyway.
Fine, great. Well, we have a precedent.
There is a precedent.
The other great publisher of Lahore postcards was actually D.C. Mehra, who was a Peshawar-based bookseller, who made these really beautiful half-tone colored cards of all the major monuments in the city. Here we have the Bank of Bengal, Bengal Bank, which I think still exists, but has all been covered up with hoardings and so forth. But the original building.
It's in Bank Square.
It's in Bank Square.
Bank Square, just opposite the GPO.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. And then we have Aijazuddin College, which Ijaz knows very well, the Chief's College, as it was often called then. And we have Hazuri Bagh as well. And these are all really nicely done cards. And really, I would say the color cards from around 1910, DC and K.C. Mehra and Sons probably did the best job and competed with Tux in their own way. This is D. Macropolo and company. And you can see that colorizing, on the left is, the Gold Masuneri Masjid. The domes are blue suddenly. I think they got the colors wrong here. So sometimes they make mistakes and choose the wrong color. But the one on the right, Chauburji, is actually a very beautiful postcard. In this case, it's actually a stenciled card. So it was actually a photograph that was then taken to the studio. They put a stencil over it and then hand-colored it green. So many of these stenciled cards, both here and in Europe, were actually hand-stenciled by women who sat in these long rows and passed the postcard, one by one for a different color. So a lot of actual handwork went into these cards as well. So Lahore in the 30s and 40s became known for making really beautiful Eid cards. These are two of them. Ghulam Muhammad and Sons, and I think Kamaruddin Haq and Sons were two of them. On the left, you see a biplane. On the right, if you look carefully, it's actually a woman riding the camel, and it's signed by an artist, Mushtaq. So the really nice cards were actually signed by artists, and it's the late 30s and early 40s, and there are a lot of these really beautiful cards. All of them done by Lahore publishers, sometimes like, I think the left one was printed in Bombay, but the right one was printed in Lahore. So let's talk about Frontier for a second and the postcards there, and you'll see there's a different flavor to Frontier postcards. So Attock Bridge, of course, was one of the most, I would say, postcarded scenes in the Frontier crossing from Punjab to Frontier. This is actually taken from within the bridge, sort of an unusual postcard. You don't see these kinds of abstract geometric shapes very much. This is Edwards Gate from the outside. This is by Holmes and Company. I don't know if you know them, but Holmes was a really famous photographer who sort of dominated with Mela Ram and Sons, dominated the Peshawar photography scene for the army as well as postcard printing, and made a lot of really beautiful sepia cards. And this is looking at Edwards Gate. Herbert Edwards was one of the early commissioners of Frontier before it became even a province. So this is looking outside of the gate. If you step inside, this is the view from inside the gate when Roos Keppel, who was the chief commissioner of Frontier, came and made a visit in 1911 to the city. And you can see how beautiful, again, this is stencil work. They've colorized actually the carpets and everything on the right, and he's walking in, and this is when he actually put the foundation stone for Islamia College. And a postcard by Melaram and Sons was actually taken, I know from the photograph, at the inauguration of Islamia College in 1913. And Roos Keppel delivered the address completely in Pashto, and he completely floored the people there. They actually, the British opened up, let the people come in from the tribal areas to witness this opening, and even the people they would be fighting with for 2-3 days, and everybody couldn't believe that Roos Keppel could speak Pashto so well. On the other hand, he had a great understanding and affection for the Pathans, but he opposed any reforms for them. So there was a lot of these contradictions in these colonial figures. This is I don't think this tradition exists anymore, but once a year in Peshawar, all the dancing girls would do a parade through the entire city. And everybody would watch, and supposedly the city went riotous. And this is a postcard of one of those scenes. This is around 1915 to 1920. This is Melaram and Sons, another really great publisher of postcards.
It's sanitized now in Lahore. It's called Fashion Week.
Okay. And this is a postcard which, I don't think people realize how much history is contained only in postcards and can't be found anywhere else. This is Mahajareen's, going to Kabul. So I spent a lot of time in previous years interviewing old red shirts, Khuda Khidmatgars, Ghani Khan, Wali Khan, others in Frontier about, the history of those days before partition, what happened, the fight against the British. And there was a complete lack of visual material. And there was almost no pictures or photographs to be found. This is actually the scene in the summer of 1920, at the end of the Khilafat movement, when so many people were so fed up about living under British rule that literally 30,000 Pathans from Charsada and Peshawar district in particular decided to all migrate to Afghanistan. And they all gathered in the bazaar and then took off. And it ended up being a disaster because they came back after many months, and Afghanistan could hardly absorb 30,000 people moving in. But that was the level of the passions then at that time, and this opposition to colonial rule. And this is a postcard which shows that event. And it's, I've never found the photograph, and it's fortunately a real photograph postcard, because at this time you had photographs turned directly into postcards, no intermediate process, so the resolution is really, really good. Now I will add that in the early 1930s, a British boys magazine used exactly the same photograph and put it on their cover, and they called it "Tribesmen Gathering in Bazaar in Search of Bargains." So, the title actually means a lot to understanding the way people interpret an image. These are some of Holmes's cards of the Frontier. The top is actually a very rare sort of panorama card. It's a card that folds into two, and you can open it up. You can see the Khyber Pass and the frontier into Afghanistan. And these are some of the sort of type cards. On the left is a Holmes card, on the right is a Melaram card. Really strong character here, who's sort of looking back into the camera quite fearlessly, and it's quite evocative, actually. I will say this, the frontier was a constant place of dispute and fighting of the British troops, with local tribes people, not only in Afghanistan, but, in the various areas as well. So there was a constant string of warfare. And there are some very disturbing cards, which I'll show you one or two right now, from the frontier, which are unlike anything else in the subcontinent. You had, for example, this is the hanging place where Ghazis were hung in Peshawar jail. And this is from Johnson and Hoffman in Calcutta. I have not seen any other such sort of, a place depicted in a postcard. And these four cards actually show, quote, loosvalas, or frontier raiders who had come down and were attacking cantonment areas. And their bodies were actually shown dead or bloated or bloodied or cut up on a postcard that was shown. This is, I think, P.D. Kapoor and Sons, also a Peshawar-based firms, and they were sold. And these were actually sold in Pindi, and you had, quote, frontier raiders come down to Pindi and shot in Westridge, and then their dead bodies were turned into postcards. And other than sort of, postcards of lynchings in the US, I don't know of anything else quite like that. On the right, in 1928-29, the king of Afghanistan was overthrown by a, quote, bandit king, Bacha Khan Saku, and he was then killed by, sort of a fight back and forth. This right two postcards show him, quote, stoned to death on the bottom and hung on the top. No one knows quite which it was. You had postcards of both events shown, but it just shows, in a sense, the level of violence that expressed itself in postcards of the frontier, which is quite unusual for postcards of the subcontinent in general. So Balochistan.
Before you...
Yeah, please.
Who did you send postcards like this to? Your
Exactly.
mother-in-law?
I know. And so, most of them you find in albums from British soldiers. That's where actually I find most of these postcards, and they would be sent in envelopes. I don't have many of them with messages that I can sort of recall off. But yeah, I know it's kind of, it's a sort of a war trophy type thing. It's sort of disturbing.
How could they justify a print run of gory photographs? I mean, that is what is so
and they had enough people
surprising.
to sell them to. Exactly. Yes.
Exactly.
That's right. Yeah.
And of course, something if I may just elaborate, it's one has to remember, and you mentioned the figure of a billion postcards having been produced in its heyday, and the attrition was such that you are now, like I am, scavenging for these postcards. Right. So it meant that the mortality ratio of these postcards was very high. Yes. I mean, they were used and thrown away. Thrown away. So that is what makes them so precious, the survivors so precious. Please.
But I will add one thing. Postcard collecting was very much a woman's business, and women actually put the albums together. And it's thanks to their care of these albums that we actually can buy these on the market today. So if I look at my collection, I think the ratio of postcards mailed to women over men is 2.5 to 1. And it's similar for many other sort of, women studies scholars who are exploring this right now. So women set the taste from the earliest days. They kind of controlled the parlors and the albums that were put together. And Queen Mary is a great example, because when she came here with her husband to tour India, it was actually she who took all the albums that he sent to his son and put them together into albums of India, which I've used, from Windsor Castle. So it's a very interesting kind of phenomenon, one of the first forms of visual media, in a sense, that really women were kind of in control of, and we have to thank for the postcards that were saved. So Balochistan. There are tons of postcards of Balochistan, and that's because the army was there and there were a lot of great engineering feats. And I'll just mention, it's not natural that every place had a lot of postcards. Bangladesh, former East Bengal, I do not have 10 postcards from there. And it was a vast area. And there were all sorts of photographers in Kolkata and Orissa and Malabar, and there are certain parts of India that are kind of blank as far as postcards go. But Balochistan is not one of them. There are a lot of postcards. And we can start with Bremner, who was in Quetta from 1888 on. This is the opening of the Kojak Tunnel, 2.5-mile tunnel that was built through to go to Chaman, which was a really great engineering feat. And I should say that these engineering feats in Balochistan of bridges and tunnels were celebrated all over the world for being such enormous efforts and extremely costly. You can see this. This was the Chopa Rift, which was, this is this sort of a place in the Balochistan sort of landscape, which is literally parted by an earthquake, and they had to build this bridge to connect the two. And it actually kept falling down. And in the 40s, it was finally abandoned in the early 40s because it was too expensive to keep up. But this is a very famous postcard. This is Malik Brothers, another Quetta firm, which did really well with sort of color cards. And Baluchi people are, of course, very interesting. They're the one people with the Andaman Islanders who are often sort of depicted in postcards or photographed with a ruler next to them because they were so tall. And they wanted to show that, oh my God, these people are 7 feet or 6.5 feet or whatever it might be. So they actually were given this sort of, quote, scientific measurement sort of system. This is Sandeman Hall in Quetta, which was actually considered one of the more beautiful buildings of the Raj, sort of copying the Taj Mahal, and sort of then changed a little bit. This was, Sandeman is in the front. He's the man who kind of cobbled together British Balochistan, largely in a peaceful way as opposed to the frontier. But it was destroyed in the Quetta earthquake of 1932, and this is a postcard of the destroyed Sandeman Hall, and then the whole thing was taken down. It was one of the worst earthquakes ever in the subcontinent. I think 30,000 people, and much of the city was destroyed. This was the residency in Quetta, which was also destroyed at the time in the earthquake. Another building celebrated in British India for its beauty. And this is the Army Staff College, which then came to Pakistan, was used as the Army Staff College. But you were saying in the 1970s, it was destroyed by human hand.
Yes, well, what was interesting about the Army, this particular war college, was that the Staff College, as it was known in those days, How many of you have been to Quetta? Yeah, I mean, you know, there's this rift between the two parts of Quetta. The Staff College is on one side, and the rest of Quetta was on the other. And that gap proved to be a kind of cushion, insulation, when the earthquake took place. So everything on one side of the city was destroyed, Sandeman Hall, etc., and the residency, and this remained. So post-1933, this was still in existence. And then we got to it. And we've destroyed it. So when I went happily to, I wanted to verify when I was doing research on this, I wanted to verify this particular image. And I arrived there, and they had demolished it and reconstructed this hideous modern building as now the Quetta Staff College. So, you know, what nature couldn't do, we managed. So please.
So let's talk about Murray in the mountains for a moment. So I love Murray. I've spent a lot of time there. And one of my favorite publishers was a firm called Balji in Murray and Peshawar, D. Balji and Sons. And this is one of their, you know, very nice color versions. They again hand-tinted the postcard, the black and white postcard, in their studios. And this is a Dunga Gully in the snow, really nicely done with white and green. And there are a lot of these really beautiful postcards of Murray and Natya Gully by the firm. There are some in the book, and I really love collecting them. They're hard to find, but they're real jewels to me. This is 1934, so this is the Nazis had just taken over Germany, and they wanted to prove their Aryan superiority, especially over the British, by climbing Nanga Parbat before the British could. So they sent this big expedition, and they had all these postcards made of the expedition. Willy Merkel is the fellow who signed this one at the bottom. Unfortunately, they did not succeed. He actually was killed and died in this. They tried to get in 1937. They did not succeed. They were trying to prove that they were better than the British. It was only in the early 50s that an Austrian, actually, Hermann Bühl, actually climbed Nanga Parbat. But these are just some very beautiful postcards in any case of the expedition there, and I have collected the whole set. These are just one or two from it. So let's talk about Sindh for a moment, which is another place where Bremner was very active from the very beginning. These are natives from Hyderabad on the left. And it's just interesting to look at them and realize the mixture of Western and Eastern clothes that already existed here at the sort of late Victorian age. Probably this is a photograph from the 1890s. The right one, Shikarpur Bazaar. Shikarpur was a place where there were not many British, so it was not very well photographed at all. And you can there's a sort of, the number of British people in a place helped determine how many photographs of that place existed. This one on the right is a very beautiful picture that actually made it to National Geographic in 1924, and also is a very sort of evocative postcard.
Because of the woodwork. Shikarpur was known for its woodwork.
Exactly, exactly. And this is another postcard which I really, really like by Bremner. So in the back, we see the Lansdowne Bridge, which was actually the longest cantilever bridge ever built. At the time, it was 1890s, I think it was opened.
That's right.
Yeah. So if you look at the way he has, put the boat in the front and propped the sticks against it, it kind of repeats that sort of cantilevers. You sort of see the crisscross across the bridge. It sort of contrasts the old and the new. Obviously, the bridge put these boatmen out of business in many different ways. But it would have taken a lot of time to set up an albumin photograph like this, where the water was just right, the boat wasn't moving, everything was propped correctly. So you can see the great care that someone like Bremner took into making a photograph that actually told something of a story about this place. And this is Sucker Barrage, then called Lloyd's Barrage, opened in the early 30s. This was the greatest and biggest irrigation project in the history of mankind. 6 million acres in Sindh came under cultivation. Some of the separate canals were bigger than the Suez Canal in terms of digging. So it really transformed the province and really helped make Karachi a major port, and grew so much wheat and rice and all those things. And of course have created problems now like waterlogging and salinity. Postcards, since we're in Sucker for a moment, I couldn't resist showing you these. It's funny, you had the filmy industry take off in the late 15s and so forth. There's actually a relationship with the postcard industry. Most of the postcards of filmy stars from Bombay publishers are pretty cheap postcards. But there were two publishers in Sucker who made these really beautiful real photo postcards of silent film stars and then hand colorized them. So you see Miss Akhtara and I think another guy on the left. And just really done very nicely and very evocative of what the times were and what silent film cinema was like, especially in the 20s here. Mohenjo-daro was discovered in the 20s, and that led to pushing the history of the subcontinent back 2,000 years, and postcards were there to celebrate that as well. These are from some of the original archaeological photographs of the time. This is Peshawar this is Karachi at the very beginning. This is Elphinstone Market, and as you know, they're clearing the bazaar, all the little shops that have come up in front these days, trying to restore it to this state. And this is Nusservanji and Company, a big Karachi-based business, retail business, a manufacturer. And again, the whole right side was for a message. So this is about 1902. And this is the wharf showing all these coal sort of carts in Karachi. And this is Fair Hall. This is M.G. Shahani and Company, another really nice and unique, distinctive sort of postcard publisher with some really beautiful colors. This is Fair Hall, Queen Victoria statue on the left. This is this Kotari parade. This is where Clifton, now they've actually built a kind of horrible sort of overfly where you can't even see this properly anymore. I was quite shocked to see that when I was in Karachi a few days ago.
You wouldn't know who built it.
I do not know who built it, no. Okay. Well.
He's just been exonerated.
Oh, okay.
Please.
Fine. Let us continue. So this is 1919. A Frenchman was flying a biplane from Paris to Australia, and he had to stop in Karachi. And you had a Karachi photographer, Ignacio Sequeira, take this picture, show his plane. He was stuck in Karachi for 2 days during his repair. I put a photograph of him, Etienne Poulet, at the top, and then Tux printed a card like this. So this sort of celebration of technological achievement was very much on people's minds there, and I think postcards were part of that sort of expression. So the independence movement, as I said in the very beginning, postcards were taken by, yes. Oh, I'm a couple more slides. So let's jump into this. Yeah. So Muhammad Ali, Maulana Muhammad Ali was a very popular postcard subject, Khilafat movement, 1919. Many of you may know of him. This is Shaukat Ali going to prison in 1921 in Karachi jail. Even that was put on postcards. So postcards played a big role in the independence movement. And you had someone like Lala Lajpat Rai, who was actually killed here in Lahore, a big figure in 1928. You had a French postcard come out giving his entire speech. This right postcard, I'll just say for a moment, this is a real photograph turned into a painting, photographed again, turned into a bromide postcard, sent here to India. This was in Karachi, actually. Hand-colored, and then glitter is applied to the postcard. So that stuff is actually glitter. And when I buy these postcards and the glitter falls out, I feel really, sorry that something is being destroyed. Bhagat Singh, as you know, was killed here in Lahore. Another major figure in postcards. Millions of postcards of him were produced in many different ways. This is Karachi Congress 1931, right after Bhagat Singh was executed. This is where the Congress Party demanded India's independence. Johnny Postcards was a big postcard publisher, worked with the army in Karachi, but that was his day job. But his night job, these are actually Janki Das, would be to go to places like this and shoot all these postcards and sell them of people in the freedom movement. So you had all these people playing a double role in supporting the independence movement, even when they worked for the British. And this is Quaid-e-Azam, sort of in a standard postcard. This is from the early 40s, and in an Eid card as well. And these are early Muslim Leaguers shown on cards with a Pakistan overprint stamp from October, I think this is 1947. And this is the Independence Day celebration in Karachi, August 14th, 1947. I think this is where Quaid-e-Azam's Mazar is. I think today, although okay. So that's last two slides. I just wanted to show we just had some very successful exhibitions in India, both in Mumbai, in Delhi, in Goa, just closed last month. And just to show you what the inside of the exhibition looked like for a second. I guess it's not wanting to go. Oh, yes. So this was at the Bhauda Jilad Museum in Bombay. And it was really funny. I went back anonymously to watch people go through the exhibition on my final day. And everybody was whipping out their iPhones and taking pictures of the postcards. So I thought that was a great, turn of history. And we're actually working to try and bring an exhibition of Pakistan postcards, to Lahore and to Karachi, in 2020 or beyond. And so that's all I have to say.
That was wonderful. Thank you. Any sponsors of the exhibition? Meet us afterwards. Okay, that was wonderful. Questions, Q&A, please. Yeah, question only though, no statements.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. Collect the microphone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't think it's on.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah.
I understand that the book came out in 2018, August 2018 or October last year in India. It's been available on Amazon UK and US as well as Amazon In. We're still waiting, I imagine?
Yes, I know. You know, I want to bring it here. I think Vanguard Books has a few, or they're taking some orders. We're trying to get a whole shipment over here.
I would like that, sir.
I'm working on it. So, you know, it's like, yeah, it's complications. It's published in India. So, but we're definitely hoping with the exhibition to bring more than enough books here.
Yes, because if I'm not mistaken, Amardeep Singh launched a book called Sikh Heritage, A Lost Legacy last year. He was here at LLF. And his books are available easily through Liberty. And I've been looking to purchase one of yours. However, I've been disappointed so far. So I just wanted to mention it. Thank you.
We'll try and fix that.
Any other questions? Please? None? Okay.
Yeah.
Then with, sorry? How long did it take you to collect?
Oh, how long did it take me to collect? So I've been collecting since 1995. So, and you know, this is like 23, 24 years later. And I probably buy 5 to 10 postcards a week. So I'm constantly collecting and adding to the collection because it's full of surprises. And it's just unbelievable how much history actually exists on these objects. And sometimes the messages are very interesting. So yeah, I'm a lifelong collector, you might say. It's an addiction. So, you know, there are a lot online. eBay is a great place. There are sort of specialist postcard sites in France, in Germany, in Britain as well. But the funnest place to collect them is at postcard fairs. So all over the US and England, especially in Europe, they have postcard fairs twice or 3 times a year where all these dealers come together and they have boxes of cards, you know, always labeled India. They hardly ever label Pakistan separately. And then you just go through these boxes and you find postcards that you like and then you haggle with the guy, just like in the bazaar, and then you sort of take them away. And you make great discoveries like I found women baking bread. That were a postcard, by the way, that I have never seen again, except for once or twice in 25 years. So it's a very sort of special and surprising things that turn up at these exhibitions. Yes? Okay.
Okay, what do you think about the future of these postcards? Because postcards is everything from social psycho to the economic situations to the history to the culture, everything. So what do you think now is the future of postcards? Because we think it is a tradition or is a classic of our history, but where it is right now. Because you are connecting us from subcontinent, because you are telling the story of 102 years plus.
Right.
So what do you think now? Do you think that this culture can come in, or do you think that it has a future or not? What do you say?
So let me give you 2 answers. I think the concept of the postcard, sending an image with a message and a personalized message, is still very much alive today in the digital form. So this is the root of that. As far as these postcards go, what I'm doing is taking about 3,000. So all of these postcards, I should say, we've restored. We've digitally restored them. And one of the nice things about the book is that we've actually all got beautiful postcards because we fixed them. So we've got about 3,000 postcards, maybe 700-800 of Pakistan. I'm putting them all online for free in the coming year on archive.org, putting them to different archives. I want to put them back into circulation so people can use them for art, for understanding history, doing a proper taxonomy and so forth around them. So my goal is to put them back into the public domain and let people use them any which way they want for free. Still a project ongoing. It takes a lot of effort, but we're about to do that.
I advise you to access Omar's website, which is called harappa.com. How many hits do you get on it?
We get, tens of thousands of people a month. So harappa.com is another site I run. That's just the Indus Valley, but this is going to be paperjewels.org. Right. And we publish a new postcard every day on Instagram. And we're putting a new one up on the site every day. And at some point, when we get the time, I'm going to put all of them on and put them on archive.org, the TIFFs, so the very high-resolution images that, obviously you can use.
Any other questions? All right, let me just conclude. Omar has given you examples of the types of postcards, the techniques that were used, lithographs, color tabs, etc., and also the frequency with which these postcards would crisscross continents, in effect. The major photographers were located in Shimla, in Peshawar, in Murray, Lahore, etc. And I found when I was doing research into Bremner's work, for example, the only book I could trace of Quetta, which contained the photographs by Bremner, and it was published by Bremner, was with Minu Marker, whose father had bought it, okay? Now, that to me was a sad reflection that there was only one copy of this book by Bremner available in Pakistan of early photographs of Quetta. It just so happened that I was able to collect a number of the pictures originating from Bremner, but available in Quetta. My reason for mentioning this is that what Umar's book has done is that he has shared, as he will do through his website, but he has shared what is our precious history. And that is what I regard as the prime value of this book. He has not only published them, but he has shared them with us. So while you may not be able to get the book at the moment, but it's there and it's available for you for the discerning reader. The second is that for us, our history is illustrated in this, what I'm going to describe as a chronicle of photo history. It comes in whether it's in watercolors, whether it's in photographs, whether it's in lithographs, but these portray what we were when we were. And that is, for me, the major contribution of your book. So the last thing I'm going to suggest is, if any of you have any parents or grandparents or archives or material hanging around in your attics or in your basements or whatever, please, this is the time, bring them out and have them photographed, okay? Preserve them, because that is the most important thing. And we will be having a session in the afternoon where we'll be dealing with the Royal Collection, in which Emily will be interacting with me, and we'll dilate on the question of the importance of building up collections. For me, and for hundreds and thousands of other people, Umar is priceless, because Umar has done it selflessly. It's not easy being a one-man museum without any support from the state, without any support from any patron, but to do it on your own with the dedication that has now gone over decades. So may I ask you to thank Omar Khan with an ovation. Thank you very much indeed, Omar. Okay?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Brilliant.